This lake wasn't just land, it was legacy. 3,000 acres of crystal clear water, dense pine forests, quiet wooden docks, and memories that stretched back generations. My grandfather used to say the lake had its own heartbeat. He believed, if you listened carefully enough, you could hear the land speaking through the wind and water. I hadn't been back here in years, but the moment I stepped onto that old dock again, I knew something felt different. The air was heavier somehow. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt controlled. I stood there looking across the water while the morning sunlight reflected off the lake like glass. Everything looked beautiful on the surface. The cabins were still standing. The forest still surrounded the shoreline. The water still stretched endlessly into the distance. But deep down I could feel something was wrong. It didn't take long before I found out exactly what it was. That's when she appeared. The HOA president. Blonde hair. Expensive red blazer. Papers clutched tightly in her hand like she had been waiting for this moment. She marched down the dock toward me with the confidence of someone who believed they owned everything around them. She didn't even introduce herself politely. She immediately started talking about fees, permits, lake access rules, and community regulations. Then she handed me a stack of documents and claimed I owed the HOA thousands of dollars for lake usage rights. I stared at her in disbelief. Lake usage rights? I asked. She looked me directly in the eyes and said the HOA had managed and controlled the lake for decades. According to her, nobody used the property without their permission. That was the first moment I realized something serious was happening. I took the documents back inside the cabin and started reading carefully. First glance, everything looked official, legal language, signatures, HOA, regulations. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it became. Fees for services that didn't exist. Maintenance charges that made no sense. Agreements connected to names I didn't recognize. None of it felt legitimate. The more I reviewed the paperwork, the more obvious it became that something had been hidden behind layers of complicated rules for a very long time. A sheriff's SUV eventually pulled near the dock while the argument outside continued. The sheriff himself stepped out calmly and watched from a distance. He didn't look aggressive, he looked uncertain, like even he knew this situation wasn't normal. The HOA president kept trying to pressure me into signing forms and acknowledging their authority over the lake. But I refused. Something deep inside me kept telling me to investigate further. So I did. Over the next several days, I walked nearly every section of the shoreline. I followed old property markers hidden near the forest trails. I checked faded maps left behind in the cabin office. I searched through old family records stored in dusty boxes. And little by little, the truth started revealing itself. The original land deed clearly showed that the lake belonged entirely to my family's property. Trusts decades before the HOA even existed. There were no shared ownership agreements, no transfer of authority, no legal control handed over. The HOA had simply expanded their influence slowly over time until people accepted it as normal. That realization changed everything. I began inspecting areas near the shoreline more carefully. That's when I noticed unusual underground pipe systems hidden beneath old maintenance structures near the water. At first I thought they were abandoned utilities, but after tracing them farther, I discovered active control valves and water management systems connected directly to the lake. Someone had secretly built infrastructure underneath the property. The deeper I explored, the more disturbing it became. There were hidden water diversion systems, redirecting resources toward private HOA-controlled developments nearby. Old fences had been moved farther into the property over the years. Boundary markers had been relocated. They hadn't just controlled access to the lake, they had quietly taken pieces of it for decades. I started documenting everything immediately. I recorded videos of the underground systems. I've photographed property markers. I've scanned old legal documents and compared them against modern HOA maps. Every piece of evidence told the same story. This wasn't confusion, it was organized manipulation. Meanwhile, panic started spreading inside the HOA itself. Word traveled quickly that I was challenging their authority. Some board members reportedly began questioning the HOA president directly. Meetings grew tense. People who once blindly followed her started demanding answers, but she still tried to intimidate me. One afternoon she confronted me again near the dock, yelling loudly while holding another stack of papers. Her voice echoed across the shoreline as she warned me not to interfere with community operations. But by then, I wasn't afraid anymore. I had evidence, and evidence changes everything eventually. I found the hidden control room. It sat beneath an aging maintenance building, partially concealed behind thick pine trees. Inside were industrial valves, pressure systems, monitoring equipment, and decades of modifications connected directly to the lake's water flow. The entire setup had been hidden in plain sight. Standing inside that room, I realized how deep this operation actually went. Every year they profited from lake access fees, controlled shoreline usage, and redirected resources while pretending it was all legal community management. That's when I decided to shut the system down, one by one. disconnected illegal control points tied to the lake infrastructure. I documented every step carefully while ensuring nothing dangerous happened to the environment itself. The moment the systems stopped operating, the entire structure of control they built over decades started collapsing. The HOA president looked stunned for the first time since I arrived. She had nothing left to say. No threats, no fake authority, just silence. Soon after, legal notices began arriving. Once attorneys reviewed the evidence, things escalated quickly. The sheriff himself examined the documents, videos, and land records. Even he admitted the situation appeared far more serious than a simple property disagreement. An official investigation followed inside the HOA office. Chaos reportedly exploded. Board members blamed one another while emergency meetings stretched late into the night. Years of hidden actions were suddenly exposed all at once, and then the case finally went to court. Walking into that courtroom felt surreal. Everything that happened around the lake now sat under bright lights in front of attorneys, witnesses, reporters, and a judge. The HOA president no longer looked confident. The aggressive attitude she carried by the lake had completely disappeared. She sat quietly beside her lawyer while stacks of evidence filled the courtroom tables. My legal team presented the original land deeds first. Then came the map showing illegal boundary expansions over time. Then photographs, then videos. Every piece connected perfectly. The courtroom became completely silent while the judge reviewed the records. Then the video footage from the underground systems appeared on screen. You could actually hear people reacting quietly throughout the room. The sheriff later testified as well, confirming inconsistencies discovered during the investigation. His testimony carried enormous weight at that point. The situation was impossible to deny. Years earlier, the HOA had quietly started installing systems nobody questioned. They gradually expanded control over access points, utilities, and shoreline areas while presenting everything as ordinary management. But under legal review, the entire structure fell apart. The truth wasn't loud. It was precise, and precision won. Finally, after hours of testimony and review, the judge delivered the ruling. The HOA had no lawful ownership or controlling authority over the lake. All unauthorized systems and restrictions tied to the property were invalid. Just like that, decades of false control ended. The HOA president sat there speechless while papers slowly slipped from her hands. Everything she built, her power, around disappeared in a single moment. I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there quietly, knowing the truth had finally been recognized. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the entrance asking questions while cameras flashed non-stop. News stations quickly picked up the story. Headlines spread across the region describing years of hidden HOA control finally being exposed. People were shocked by how long it had gone unnoticed. But the biggest change happened back at the lake itself. Without the restrictions and illegal systems in place, the property slowly returned to normal. Families started visiting again. Kayaks returned to the water. Fishermen lined the docks early in the mornings. Children laughed near the shoreline without fear of random HOA warnings. The atmosphere completely changed. One evening, I sat quietly on the dock while the sunset reflected across the water in shades of orange and gold. For the first time in years, the lake felt peaceful again. No pressure, no tension, just natural silence. I pulled out an old family photograph taken beside the lake decades earlier. My grandfather stood near the same shoreline, smiling proudly while holding a fishing rod. The water behind him looked exactly the same. That moment made me realize something important. This was never about power, it was about protecting something that mattered. The abandoned HOA office eventually became quiet. Meetings stopped. Threats disappeared. The influence they once carried over the community slowly faded away. Even people around town began talking differently about the lake, not with frustration anymore, but with pride.